Good day, sir. I am Johnny Berstria, one of the reporter of Group 5. Today, I am going to discuss my topic. It's all about human trafficking. What is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar form of international or international organized crime constituting modern-day slavery. So, human trafficking is also called modern-day slavery, just a commodity for criminals. Victims of trafficking are merely commodity that can be used and even sold for financial gain. So, that is one of the reasons why we have human trafficking, because of the financial gain. There's a total disregard for human dignity and rights. There is no single profile of trafficking victims. Victims of human trafficking can be anyone regardless of race, color, national origin, disability, religions, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, level, or citizen status. So, as we see in the slides, everyone can be vulnerable as a victim of human trafficking. As we said earlier, who is the vulnerable of human trafficking? Human trafficking can be happen to anyone, but some people are more vulnerable than others. Significant risk factors include recent migration, relocation, substance use, and mental concerns involving with children's welfare and runaway homeless youth. So, most of human trafficking we can see is one example kay we Philippines, because we Philippines are a member of the Global South. So, we are the developing countries. So, the standard living of the developing countries low standards. So, that's why kanang as of we kanang that's why they are more Filipinos are engaged in human trafficking, because because of their daily needs. So they need financial in order to sustain their daily life. That's why nang ni ni active sila sa human trafficking because of the financial. Types of human trafficking: trafficking for forced labor or trafficking for forced criminal activities, trafficking in women for sexual exploitation. So one example ani kay kanang cyber trafficking. So kanang maybe kanang as of today kanang situations kay mura magdili na siya force, kay which is kagustuhan na mangguro sila kay in order to mo lagi provide financial assistance. So trafficking and trafficking for removal organs. So removal organs, so which is kanang for example kanang kidney, kanang ang person kay ilang ibaligya ilang kidney more pod sa para makakita kwarta in order to provide their daily life needs. People smuggling. Cause of human trafficking: poverty, war, natural disaster, and search for a better life. So one ng mga example kay we Filipino are delimigid ka ng high standard ng living. So one mo na siyang nata diri sa poverty. Women and children are target because of sexual interest, demand for cheap labor. Human trafficking generate a huge profit. How to prevent human trafficking? Foster the spread of education. So education good, so that many people would can have a better understanding in terms of situation in life. Spread awareness among parents and communities. So man siya good kanang mga mag-spread tag awareness sa atong sa urban families, sa communities, in order to prevent strict laws in place to prevent child trafficking. So amo gid na siya good example kanang maghimog yaglo na kanang bugat in order to the traffickers are mahadlok sila pagsud ana ng dili na maayong binuhatan. So encouraging business to not use labor. So nang lagi nang asa kanang para ng mga LGUs mga sa municipality mo provide sila kana, for example sa diri sa amo to nila na negosyo center, which is kanang it helps ta kanang mga people to manay mo hatag og puhunan para katabang sa ilang mga pangnegosyo ang ginagmay. So nga na dapat. That's all. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Decadet Jetler G. Paliaro. So for today's video, I'm going to discuss about one of the example of human trafficking, which is human trafficking in forced labor. Forced and bonded labor is probably the least known form of slavery today, and yet it is the most widely used method of enslaving people. Between 12 and 20 million people are kept on debt bondage and under forced labor conditions around the world. So what is forced labor? According to the ILO, or International Labor Organization, forced labor is defined as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So, the ILO Forced Labor Convention 29, 1930, Article 2, the term forced labor includes slavery and practices similar to the slavery as well as bonded labor or debt bondage. So, the ILO definition generally applies to work or service exacted by governments and public authorities as well as private bodies and individuals. So, the ILO has developed several elements which individually or in conjunction can indicate a forced labor situation. These are threats or actual physical harm, restriction of movement or confinement to the workplace or a limited area, debt bondage, withholding wages or excessive wage reduction that violates previously made agreements, retention of passports and identity documents, print and denunciation to the authorities when the worker has an irregular immigration status. So, how are forced labor and trafficking in person interrelated? Trafficking in persons is the accusation of people by improper means such as force, fraud, deception with the aim of exploiting them. Trafficking includes different means of exploitation such as slavery or slavery-like practices, forced labor or services, and prostitution or other form of sexual exploitation. UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. In the 2005 Global Report on Forced Labor, the ILO estimates that about 20% of all forced labor is an outcome of trafficking. Of those trafficked into forced labor, 43% are trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation, and the 32% are trafficked for economic exploitation, and the remaining 25% are trafficked for mixed or undetermined reason. What are the some examples of forced labor? These are the agriculture and fishing, domestic work, construction, mining, quarrying and brick kilns, manufacturing, processing and packaging, prostitution and sexual exploitation, market trading and illegal activities. So, forced labor is the most common element of modern slavery. It is the most extreme of people exploitation. Although many people associate forced labor and slavery with physical violence, in fact, the ways used to force people to work are more insidious and ingrained in some cultures. Forced labor often affects the most vulnerable and excluded groups. For example, commonly discriminated Dalits in India. Women and girls are more at risk than boys and men. And children make up a quarter of people in forced labor. The migrant workers are targeted because they often don't speak the language, have few friends, have limited rights, and depend on their employers. Forced labor happens in the context of poverty, lack of sustainable jobs and education, as well as weak rule of law, corruption, and economy dependent on cheap labor. Why does forced labor still exist? Poverty and discrimination breed the condition in which forced labor practices persist. Poor people are often in need of cash just for daily survival, which forces them to sell their labor in exchange for a lump sum of money or a loan. They are tricked or trapped into working for very little or no pay, often for long hours and 7 days a week. The value of their work is invariably greater than the original sum of money borrowed. Forced laborers are routinely threatened with subjected to mental and physical violence, with women and girls being disproportionately affected by sexual violence. Forced laborers are kept under various forms of surveillance, sometimes even by armed guards. Entire families can be held under the forced labor conditions, making it even harder for individual family members to escape. Vice versa, forced labor systems lock marginalized groups such as women and children into extreme poverty, since they have few possibilities to take self-determined decisions and consequently to elude the vicious circle of forced labor conditions. In most countries, legislation against various forms of forced labor exists. But however, law enforcement is weak and corruption is widespread. Hence, the vast majority of perpetrators remain unpunished. This helps keep forced labor exploitation a low risk but highly profitable operations.
So good evening everyone, and to you sir, good evening. So I am the Cadet Locayan Melcher III. So my topic is one of the example of human trafficking, which is trafficking for forced criminal activities. So first, what is forced criminal activities? So criminal activity means that any conduct that is prohibited by any criminal laws, whether federal, state, or country, regardless, or whether there has been an arrest or conviction and without satisfying the standard of proof for a criminal conviction. Criminal activities include drug crimes, different forms of property crimes, social benefit fraud, and organized begin. Criminal activities may force adults and children to commit crimes in the course of their victimization, including theft, illicit drug production and transport, prostitution, terrorism, and murder. So, it is important that governments develop and implement policies to spot trafficking victims who are forced to participate in criminal activities within the course of their victimization and supply them with appropriate protective service. Additionally, to general awareness training on human trafficking, training enforcement and judicial officials about the principle of non-punishment and non-persecution of victims is vital to increase the likelihood that individuals are going to be properly identified by the authorities and there be secure access to justice and protection. So next slide. What are the examples of criminal activities? First is assault and battery. For example, a person with a gun or threatening to kill someone while pointing a gun at the victim. Second is arson. Example, when a person set their home on a fire to collect the insurance. Third is child abuse. Example is including shaking, dropping, striking, biting, and burning by scalding or touching with cigarettes. Fourth is domestic abuse. So, the people in an intimate relationship against the other person and can take in place heterosexual or same-sex relationship or between former spouse or partners. Fifth is kidnapping, and lastly is rape and statutory rape. So next slide. Why does trafficking for forced criminal activities affect? So for me, because human trafficking is a crime that we should address because it affects the lives of people or other, and the victims are being forced to do things against their will because they are being traded in exchange of money or food. So that's all, and thank you.
So my example is sexual exploitation for women. So first of all, I will explain about what is human trafficking. So human trafficking refers to the recruitment, transportation, and transfer or harboring or receipt of irons with or without the victim's consent or knowledge within across the national borders by means of threat or use of force or the form of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, and abuse of power. And so sexual exploitation for women, trafficking in human being, especially in minors and young women for purpose of sexual exploitation, has become an issue of major concern globally because of its rapid growth in recent years. And the phenomenon has become more transnational in scope. An important feature of the increase in human trafficking has been a growing involvement of criminals organizations who exploit of the urge to immigrate felt by those who live in world's poorer nations. So, what is the causes of human trafficking? So, in the Philippines is undoubtedly a source country for human trafficking, with its citizens being trafficked in different parts of the world, mainly owing to the social economic condition prevailing in different parts of the country, including growing poverty, youth and unemployment, and gender inequalities and discrimination. So, example of human trafficking or sexual exploitation for women is women and girls are usually trafficked for the purpose of sexual and economical exploitation, particularly prostitution and pornography, forced labor, including for work in commercial agriculture and domestic work, arranged marriage, or to be sold as brides, recruitment for participation in hostilities, and such related purposes as sexual service, portage, and domestic functions in conflict situations. Women's and girls' experience of trafficking is different to that of women and boys, men and boys. Women and girls tend to suffer a disproportionately heavy impact, whereas trafficked men find it difficult to access existing programmers for victims assistance. This requires the inclusion of gender equality principle in formulation and implementation of legislation and programs aiming at the prevention of trafficking in humans.
So good day to my fellow cadet, especially to you, sir. I am here to discuss my topic about the trafficking for the removal of organs. So organ trade is the trading of human organs, tissues, or other body products, usually for transplantation. According to the World Health Organization or WHO, organ trade is a commercial transplantation where it have a profit. So transplantation of occurs about outside of national medical system. So there are three types of trafficking for organ removal. We have first, victim are forced deceived into giving an organ. Second, people are agreeing to sell their organs, but then they are either not paid less than what was agreed. And the third, people seek medical treatment and then have their organs removed without their consent. So trading for the purposes of organ removal involves removal of an organ from a person's body for the purposes of a commercial transaction in human body parts, while relating to the actual person as the subject of the transaction. The victims of trading for the purpose of organ removal usually have a background of economic hardship. Unregulated organ removal has severe ramifications for the health of the victims, especially physically, mentally, and psychologically. So generally, organs are not able to move or traded independently to their source. As well, they only survive for short periods of time independent of body, so almost 24 hours. So according to the most likely organs to be trafficked are kidneys, livers, as these are able to be pursued for living donors. So countries with indigent or vulnerable populations frequently have a greater uh, ability of organs for medical use, since members of these populations are often tempted to risk their health and give up an organ with the promise of monetary compensation. So, as we can observe here in our country, which is the Philippines, people living in poverty with low level of education and few employment opportunities. We have most vulnerable to trafficking for organ removal. So this problem exists because there is a shortage of legally obtained organs and increasing number of people waiting for transplant. So as you can observe here in our country, people who are oppressed, vulnerable, and living in a poverty are targets for organ trafficking. Like for the example, organ harvesting, when a person killed for their organs. There are many countries who are selling and buying organs. We have Israel, China, Colombia, Pakistan, Turkey, Brazil, Nepal, Lebanon, Taiwan, and here in our country, which is the Philippines. People who were oppressed, vulnerable, and living in a poverty are targets of organ trafficking. These people sell their own organs and tissue for a very little compensation. With organ harvesting, people are drugged, kidnapped, and murdered for their organs. With that, the organs are then illegally transplanted from anywhere from $20 to $200. Most of people who sold their organs is the Pakistan men who sold their kidneys for money. So those are my topics all about the trafficking for the removal of organs.
So good day, sir. My name is Retune Elcadot, and today we talk about people smuggling. So, what is people smuggling? It's also called human smuggling. Underneath the law is the facilitation, transportation, attempted transportation, or illegal entry of a person across an international border in violation of one or more countries' law, either or through reception such as the use of fraudulent. So like for example, of smuggling. A group of people charges money from migrants to drive them across a border into another country, thus bypassing the official entry requirements and border controls of the destination country. So we all know that smuggling is the illegal transportation of objects, substances, information, or people such as out of the house or buildings into a prison, or across an international border in violation of applicable laws or other regulations. There, was, there are various motivations to smuggle. So, why people smuggling? People smuggling because generally takes place with the consent of the persons of being smuggled. And the common reason for it is the individual seeking to be smuggled include employment and economic opportunity, personal and or familial betterment, and escape from persecution, violence, or a conflict. So why does smuggling occur? So much smuggling occurs when enterprising merchants attempt to supply demand for a good or service that is illegal or heavily taxed. The profits involved in smuggling goods appear to be extensive. The law of the prohibition dictates that the greater in sports enforcement result is more potential alcohol and drugs being smuggled. So what is the punishment for smuggling? So if you are convicted of drug smuggling in federal court, you could face a potential punishment of 10 years of life in prison and up to $5 million in fines. True, there are certain circumstances that can significantly increase the criminal penalties resulting for drug smuggling conviction. So, in this smuggling, people have the effect of it. So, the effect is it creates the instability when smuggling overtakes a functioning economy, and also it creates instability, and this is then discourages business and investment from coming into the area. For these reasons, the other besides smuggling is highly illegal and results in fines and lengthy prison sentence.
Good day, I am Cadet Aviara Victor Joseph. So, my topic is all about the three elements of human trafficking: the act, the means, and the purpose. Act plus means plus purpose is equals to human trafficking. So, the act, what is done, the means, how it is done, and the purpose, why it is done. So, some example of act is recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, receipt of the persons. Some example of means, threat or use of force, adoptions, deceptions, abuse of power or vulnerability, giving payments or benefit. And some example of the purpose, exploitations including prostitute of others, sexual exploitations, forced labor, slavery or similar practices, removal of organs. So first, the first element is the act or human trafficking, or what is done. A person become a human trafficker if he or she does any of the following act of the purpose of exploitation: recruits another person for the purpose of exploitations, transport or transfer another persons. So transporting involves moving a person to another place in order to exploit them. A trafficked persons may travel normally and legally with a passport if they're crossing a border by bus, car, air, train, or other transportations. Harbor or receives another persons for the purpose of exploitations. Harboring or receiving occurs when a human trafficker hides or houses a trafficked person and keeps them under control in order to exploit them. The element of human trafficking is the means of human trafficking, or how it is done. Traffickers use a variety of tactics to get a trafficked persons to do what they want and to maintain control, including the use of violence or threat of violence against the person or her friends and family. A trafficker will often use violence or the threat of violence as a control tactic. The trafficked persons may be made to fear that they or their loved ones will be sexually assaulted, beaten, or killed, or may be forced to witness the beating or sexual assault of the other to make sure they comply with the trafficker demands. Next is coercions. A trafficker may court another person through fear, such as fear of being returned to a war-torn home, being separated from loved ones, or losing immigration status. Next is abductions. Adoptions is the act of leading someone away by force or lies. Next is fraud. It's a knowing misinterpretations of the truth that induce another person to act to his or her detriment. In the context of human trafficking, fraud may involve transactions where a trafficker dupes a person into paying for forged or false travel document or work visa, or a false employment contract, in the belief these documents are legitimate in the destination's country. The trafficker may also charge an illegal fee for a job that doesn't exist. Next is deceptions. A trafficker may deceive a person into being trafficked by telling her that a well-paid job and good working conditions, or for a young person, a modeling contract or singing career await her in another place, when in a fact that she may be exploited for sex or labor. Next is abuse of power. A trafficker who is positions of control or authority over another, such as spouse, a parent, or teacher, may abuse his or her power to exploit that other person. The last element of human trafficking is the purpose of exploitation, or why it is done. So the purpose or the purposes of each trafficker used to people they traffic may vary, but the ultimate goal of the traffickers is the same. They exploit other human beings for profit, which can be financial gain or material benefit. Traffickers exploit other for a variety of purposes like sexual exploitations. Sexual exploitations, a person trafficked for sexual exploitations is forced to provide sexual acts against their will for the financial benefit or material gain of the trafficker. Next is forced labor. Forced labor, all work or services which is exacted from any persons under the menace of any penalty, and which the said persons hath not offered himself voluntarily. In the context of human trafficking, a person trafficked for forced labor is made to work for little or no pay, or maybe paid full wage but then forced to return most of it in the cash to the trafficker. So next is domestic servitude. Domestic servitude is the form of forced labor and defined as slavery or bondage. So that's all. Thank you.
Good day everyone, my name is Kadat Onyada and I am the last reporter for Group 5 with our topics are mainly concerning about human trafficking and human rights in migration. And today I'm going to report my assigned topic, which is what is the current state of human trafficking in the Philippines. Allow me to proceed to the first slide. General overview of the human trafficking situation in the Philippines. Human trafficking is one of the most despicable crimes in the world. Trafficked individuals often have to do manual labor, become sex slaves, or perform domestic servitude. Experts estimate that the number of people in slavery in the Philippines is also over 780,000. Many believe that this large number stems from the Philippines' low GDP per capita. Now, the facts concerning the human trafficking situation in the Philippines. Prostitution is illegal in the Philippines, as stated in Article 22 of the Philippine Constitution. However, many individuals in the Philippines in the recent years have pushed to enact bills that focus less on punishing the prostitutes and more on preventing and helping victims of human trafficking. The second one is Super Typhoon Haiyan increased human trafficking. The destruction of Super Typhoon Haiyan displaced more than 6 million people and left 1.9 million people homeless. The typhoon hit the provinces of Leyte and Samar the hardest. Now, I personally believe that the prostitutes are not in that industry because they want to, but because they need to make ends meet. And also, I personally believe that they do not want. Not only are they risking being arrested, but also contracting long-term health issues such as STDs and HIV. And also, when in Super Typhoon Haiyan, when people lose their lives, lose their homes, lose their livelihoods, they are going to cling to any means necessary to survive, whether it is illegal or legal. And unfortunately, human traffickers saw this opportunity and took it to its logical conclusion. Proceeding to the next slide. The human traffickers use the promise of work to lure in victims. This tactic preys on the desperation of many economically disadvantaged individuals, and children are the most vulnerable. Children are at great risk for human trafficking in the Philippines. Estimates are around to 60,000 to 100,000 children are victims of human trafficking in the Philippines. Now, the one thing that they are in common here is that people who are coming from indigenous communities and children is because those two categories, children and indigenous people, are the ones who are easily manipulated. And when traffickers saw this, they took this opportunity and offered those people too good to be true offers so that they are more enticed in participating in their illegal activities. Proceed to the next slide. The facts concerning human trafficking situation in the Philippines. Traffickers traffic people both nationally and internationally. And a good example of this is that when traffickers or international traffickers from other nationalities come into the Philippines to traffic people, mainly because we all know that the Philippines is a third world country. And when there's a third world country, then there are people who are impoverished, meaning they need to have money to make ends meet. And traffickers also saw this opportunity again to traffic people who are desperate, traffic people who don't know any better. And that is why I think that the government should take necessary steps in order to reduce this, and rightfully so, because the last one is the Filipino government is taking this issue seriously. The government has taken huge steps to cut back the amount of trafficking that takes place. The budgets of the Philippine National Police and the National Bureau of Investigation have increased with a specific interest in fighting trafficking. Now, not only has this being being seen, but it is also being recognized by other countries or international watchdogs that concerns with human trafficking. And concerning with the last slide is, the government of the Philippines fully meets the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. The government continues to demonstrate serious and sustained efforts during the reporting period. Therefore, the Philippines remained on a Tier 1. The Tier 1 meaning that the Philippines has the highest standard in maintaining and reducing the illegal activities concerning human trafficking. However, it is also stated within the report and the report of the U.S. State Department that the Philippine government has taken steps in order to reduce human trafficking. However, they lack in the department or in the area wherein convictions are done to the criminals who are responsible for victimizing or let's say running human trafficking activities, because the conviction rate is so low compared to the people in other countries. They do an excellent job in making sure that people who are doing illegal or doing human trafficking activities are stopped, but those criminals are not being punished, or specifically speaking, they are not convicted. That is why I think that the government should take more steps or more measures to ensure that those criminals get what they deserve. And I also firmly believe that it is not about the severity of the punishment, but rather the certainty of the punishment. And that is the end of my video. Good day.